Welcome back. This is week 11, lecture 1, Calvin and Geneva. And this lecture follows very naturally on the previous lecture in terms of Calvin and the French context. We kind of left off with last lecture with Calvin having fled Paris after the affair of the placards, the Protestant movement, Calvinist Protestant movement in France going underground, and then kind of foreshadowing things to come in terms of what became known as the Huguenots, or the Huguenots, or Huguenots, the French Protestants who were Calvinistic, coming into the open a bit more in the face of persecution. Meanwhile, Calvin, who was leading the movement, was safely in Geneva. Now, Calvin first went to Basel, we said in the last lecture. And that's where we kind of pick up today, kind of going back a little bit, look at the side of Calvin from the Genevan side. And with Geneva and Calvin, we really have a unique development in the Reformation, because Calvin, or I should say Geneva, under Calvin's leadership, basically became a theocracy in many ways. It was hailed by John Knox as the most godly city ever. I'll be talking more about some of this as we go along, because it was never the case that Calvin was in complete control. And what we really see in Geneva, or Calvin's Geneva, as it's often referred to, is the fusion of two different patterns of Reformation. I'll be talking more about this next week. But one is the city Reformation, the Reformation of the cities, and then the other is what's been called the Reformation of the refugees, because Calvin did not become a citizen of Geneva until very late, 1559 or 1560, shortly before his death. So he was an outsider, and he was seen as such. And the French who fled from France to Geneva were refugees from persecutions in France, and they were not necessarily a welcome presence in Geneva, and we'll see how that all plays out a bit as we go through today. So we're going to kind of look back and see the progression of Calvin and Calvinism, as it began to be called, from the time that he then flees Paris and goes to Basel in 1534. So that is what kind of where we are right now. Calvin flees in 1534 after the affair of the placards and goes to Basel. There he starts writing his the first edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is the prefatory letter thereof to Francis I, King of France. That prefatory letter is part of the reading for this week, as well as his ecclesiastical ordinances, which I'll be talking about more later this lecture. So Calvin flees, and he's there. He's in exile. His whole perspective, though, is France. His concern is France. And what he does, he realizes once he has fled France and left, and has come out in opposition to the persecution of the Protestants that Francis I began after the affair of the placards, was that, I can no longer stay a member of the Roman Church, and therefore I should actually resign my benefices. Now, a benefice, I think I've talked about this before, something that's come up before. Luther talks about the benefices and the problems with the benefices in his address to the Christian nobility. A benefice was the income from a parish that was sent basically to the bishop to pay for a priest to minister to the parish. And that the benefice was to the priest. The priest would receive a benefice. Now, it could also not only be for a priest, it could also be for a student to receive his education, kind of like a financial aid package, whereby the idea would be that that student would then, after completing his education, would return to the diocese to be a priest in the diocese. And so it became an issue of then the problem was receiving multiple benefices. If you think of benefices as a scholarship, the scholarship is what then Calvin ended up saying, I can't hold several scholarships from the church when I am, in opposition to the church of Rome, that is. Um, Now, the whole point here is not so much the system of benefices, but Calvin felt he needed to go around and resign his benefices, officially renounce his benefices. And so that is what he was doing. And that process, traveling around, that brought him to the city of Geneva. Now, Geneva was a city-state, part of the Swiss cantons, um, and it was recently independent in that in 1533, the city council of Geneva had kicked out their bishop, expelled their bishops, and we are going to bring about a reform. We're not going to be under the bishop anymore. Now, this is a phenomenon that often took place with the introduction of the Reformation, namely throwing off the overlordship and even the feudal overlordship of the bishop. A colleague of mine, a friend of mine from graduate school, wrote his dissertation in his book on the title Episcopus Exclusus, which is the bishop excluded, which what happens when you throw out the bishop. Now, I've referred to this before in terms of one of the benefits of accepting the Reformation for cities, for territories, was that all of a sudden, what do we do with the church lands, the church property? The church was the largest property owner in Europe within Christendom. And so if you cast that off, what do you do with the church's property? Well, you appropriate it, is what you do. So there was almost a financial benefit, so to speak, from proclaiming for the Reformation. Now, there's also financial problems because the church paid for a lot. And so a territory would receive funding from the church, so to speak, to pay for the priests and such. But it was seen as a boon. And that dynamic should not be ignored as well. And so when the City Council of Geneva votes and decides to expel their bishop, this attempt to institute a reformation, that was a big step. Now, they weren't the first Swiss city to do that. That was had already been Zurich under Zwingli, and you've read about Zwingli in your textbook. I haven't talked that much about Zwingli. I talked about Zwingli in terms of the Marburg Colloquy with Luther. So it's was not the first, and Bern was also a major quote unquote Protestant city by this time. And here again, Protestant meaning protesting against Rome, had thrown off their bishops. And Bern was the let's say the power that that Geneva wanted to seek their help in doing what they were doing, but yet were afraid of having a new overlord. They didn't want to become pawns of Bern once having expelled their bishop. So they're in this tense situation politically and socially. What do we do? How do we do it? And there was an older pastor there by the name of Guillaume Farel, who was helping the Genevans to organize themselves, because that's the big issue. Once we kick out Rome, now what do we do? How do we go about instituting new institutions, programs? How do we structure the church, as well, financially as well as then practically? And Farel was helping with that and trying to get something kind of fit and established in Geneva after 1533. Now, Calvin had recently issued his Institutes. First edition is 1536, but there's also circulating before that in manuscript, and people had talked about it and knew about it. Calvin was a known figure, even if not famous yet or widely known. And when Calvin is traveling through Geneva on his way to kind of his tour to resign his benefices, you kind of recognize Farel talks to him and says, Calvin, Jean Calvin, you need to stay here and help me reform Geneva. And Calvin was like, I don't know, really. I'm not even a trained theologian. What do I do? What do I do? I don't know. But he agrees. Farel, that's what I had up on the slide, Farel drafts Calvin's like, yes, he says, you got to come and help me. So Calvin does in 1536, the same year, first edition of the Institutes. And they start Farel and Calvin start to implement a structure of Reformation in Geneva. And for both, this concept of Reformation, yes, there was a theological position behind it, but it was very much a moral position of what consisted of good Christian behavior. And they started to regulate behavior in Geneva, arguing against prostitution. This list will come back later, we'll see. Prostitution, gambling, divorce, etc. And the Genevans were like, this is not all that great. Is this really what Reformation is all about? And they started having a lot of animosity toward Calvin and Farel and what they were trying to do. Or I should actually say Farel and Calvin, because Farel was the more senior of the two. Is this really what we want? There are, I'm not going to say apocryphal, but there are rumors and stories about Genevans, some of them being so disgusted with Calvin and Farel that they started naming their dogs Calvin. And that also could have been a later phenomenon, but we'll get there when we get there. But that kind of brings out some of the tensions and conflict between the citizens of Geneva, Calvin and Farel, and the city council. How do we manage all of this? And it was not a happy marriage, so to speak. And so when there was a new election in 1538, the new factions come into the small council, and that was, they decided to get rid of Farel and Calvin. So we've had enough. This is not what we're going to do. We're not going to allow these people to tell us how to live our lives like this. So they are expelled from Geneva. Calvin then goes to Strasbourg. To be quite honest, I'm not sure where Farel goes. He kind of disappears from the scene at this point. But Calvin, of course, remains a major figure. Calvin is there in Basel. Now, Basel, too, is a Swiss city. It's a beautiful city. I spent a summer in Basel researching and studying, and I loved Basel. But it is part of the territorially, geographically, it is kind of both a German and a little bit of French, but primarily it's a German-speaking area in Basel. Calvin was French; he didn't really speak German. Now, there's an individual in Basel who was serving as kind of like Calvin Farel had done in Geneva, as kind of the reformer of Basel, man by the name of Martin Butzer. Now, Butzer had been at the colloquy of Marburg. He is a very interesting figure, more what's called an irenic figure of peace. He was the one that after Zwingli and Luther could not agree in Marburg in 1529, said, future generations will laugh at us because the doctrine that should be our unity, namely the Eucharist, is turning out to be that which divides us, because Luther and Zwingli could not agree on the meaning of the word is. So, Butzer is, again, all of the major reformers have been studied a lot. But of the major reformers, Butzer is still one of the ones that has been studied less than others, let's say. His works have been edited, but still there's a lot still could be done on Martin Butzer. Very interesting guy. And Butzer kind of takes Calvin under his wing and says, okay, I have a job for you, Jean. We do have French refugees from France, from the persecutions, and they need a pastor. So how about you serve as the pastor to the French refugee community in Basel? Calvin's like, okay, again, I'm not an ordained pastor. Well, you can do it. So Calvin starts functioning as the pastor, the minister to the French refugees there in Basel, and he continues work on his institutes. I'll be talking a lot more about his institutes in the next lecture, the following lecture, which focuses on the institutes. And he issues his second edition in 1539. Now, as he's doing all of that, Geneva is struggling. Geneva just can't get its act together, doesn't really know what to do. And in 1541, there's a new city council election. I have up there the new city council, the small council. The government of Geneva was governed by a small council and then a large council. The large council was every male citizen of Geneva. The small council was a much smaller group that actually ran things. It met far more frequently. The large council met like once or twice a year and just kind of agreed to what the small council had been doing. So the real authority and power in terms of governing the city was in the small council. So we get a new faction in that small council. They say, we do need help. How about we, Farel is old, not worried about him, but how about at least we bring Calvin back? These were political factions within Geneva itself, and the political faction that actually was supporting Calvin came into the ascendancy with the new small council elections. So that's what they decide to do, and they send out an envoy to Calvin saying, Monsieur Calvin, we know we expelled you 3 years ago, but we would really like if you would come back to lead the Reformation in Geneva. And Calvin said, like, no way in hell am I going to go back to Geneva. Just as there was tensions between the Genevans and Calvin, there was tensions between Calvin and the Genevans. Calvin didn't really like the Genevans. Also, they had kicked him out. So he's like, I don't want to go back to that hellhole. No. I said, Monsieur Calvin, please. I'll tell you what we'll do. If you come back, we'll allow you to live in the Episcopal residency. Now, the Episcopal residency, keep in mind, they had expelled their bishop, was like a palace. Palace up on the hill overlooking the city. And they're saying, that could be your house, Monsieur Calvin. There's no way. That doesn't persuade me. How about then, they come back another time, we'll give you that, and we'll provide for you for an ermine coat. Then you can say, what, an ermine coat? This is ermine, one of the most expensive furs that can be had. And of course, in a place like Geneva and Switzerland, having a nice warm coat in the winter is needed. So they'll give you this very expensive piece of clothing. You could live in the Episcopal relief, basically a palace. And Calvin says, no, that's not what motivates me. And it's like, well, is there anything, Monsieur Calvin, that we could offer you that would persuade you to return to Geneva? Calvin said, well, there is one. If you will adopt my ecclesiastical ordinances, I will come back. Now, ecclesiastical ordinances, which is part of the reading for this week, lays out the structures of the church. It is a law. It is a series of laws, basically, that Calvin wanted to have the small council to adopt before he would return. Now, in addition to that, Bucer was working on Calvin. And Bucer was like, Calvin, Jean, you must go back. You must go back to Geneva. God will damn you if you don't. So with the pressure of Bucer, and with the Genevans finally saying, okay, we will accept your ecclesiastical ordinances, Calvin says, okay, then I will come back. Calvin does, and the Genevans in 1541 accept the ecclesiastical ordinances, and Calvin is now established in Geneva as the reformer of Geneva. It was not a happy union, still. Never had been, never was going to be. But now at least Calvin had the support of the city council, at least the small council. And his ecclesiastical ordinances have been adopted by the small council as basically the law of the land. And when I say land, it's the city, but remember, the Swiss cities were city-states, so it's the city itself and the city walls, and then also the territory outside the city. That was Genevan, still Genevan territory. Now, what are the ecclesiastical ordinances? Was it structured? And what it does, it sets up the structures of the quote unquote the Genevan Church, the Church in Geneva, based on Calvin's model and ideas. Now, if any of you come from the Reformed tradition, the Presbyterian tradition, but also the Reformed Church in America tradition, you will recognize some of this pretty well, I would think, because Calvin designated 4 offices of the church: the pastors, the elders, the deacons, and the teachers. The pastors were those who would preach. They were the most important, basically, the pastors, the ministers. The elders were those senior members of the community who were elected by the community, by the congregation, to serve as their leaders, to help implement reform, to help organize and actually govern the parish, whereas the pastors were kind of on top of the elders, but yet the elders was really where a lot of the power really was. Deacons were those individuals responsible for basically pastoral care, helping the poor, helping widows. This comes from the Acts of the Apostles and Stephen, who was a deacon, caring for the poor, and so that is a very important function of the church, to care for the underprivileged, the poor, the unemployed, the widows, and so. And then there were the teachers to teach the people. Now, the pastors obviously were the main teachers because they were the ones who are responsible for preaching the gospel, for preaching on the Bible. And then the teachers are the ones who are responsible for implementing that teaching throughout the various ages. What we might say Sunday school through parochial school, and on we would go. So those were the 4 offices. And then how it would all work. There would be an institution referred to as the Company of Pastors, which would consist of all the pastors within the territory of Geneva, because it's still based on territory and diocese and things. And there's not just one church, one actual parish in Geneva. There's several. Calvin is the pastor of the main one, but then there are pastors leading other congregations. And all those pastors would get together, and they formed the Company of Pastors. So they would be there to discuss the theological issues involved, how the scripture to be interpreted, how we're going to handle the preaching, and what are we going to say about things. And we have the minutes from the Company of Pastors. Robert Kingdon at the University of Wisconsin, who's dead now, but I studied with Kingdon for a year there in Wisconsin. Fantastic guy who was part from the Reformed Presbyterian tradition himself. A great guy, and a massive scholar, and importance of his scholarship on Genevan studies, because he was the one that really was editing the Company of Pastors, and, as I'll get to in a minute, the consistory. And so Robert Kingdon is a scholar, or was a scholar, of major importance for our understanding of Calvin and Geneva and how it all worked out. Now, we have the records. As I said, we have the records of the Company of Pastors. And it's a precious record, difficult to read. Not that I've really tried, because it's written, of course, in Old French or Latin. Latin would be easier, but it's basically written in Old French. And it's all handwritten, so you have to really decipher it and understand, and it's an issue. And a major project in undertaking the publication of the registers and the letters of the Company of Pastors. So that was one kind of governing body. And then the Company of Pastors would also meet together with the elders, and not the elders just of one parish, but of all the elders. And that formed, the pastors plus the elders formed what was called the consistory. And the consistory was really the governing body of the church in Geneva. By that I mean the aggregate, not a single individual parish, but all the different parishes within Geneva city walls and in their territory. That was under the auspices of the government of Geneva. The city council is a city-state, and therefore, in terms of church matters, were under the leadership of Calvin, but the authority was really with the consistory. this kind of joining of the scholars, let's say the pastors as the scholars, and then the elders, the outstanding members of the community that actually were the governing body of the church in Geneva. Now, as we'll see, the consistory became a feared institution. It was because it had authority, and we'll see shortly, it was really the instrument by which Calvin ruled. If we want to talk about Geneva as a theocracy, it's not necessarily just Calvin that's an issue, it's the consistory. And what gave it such power and authority, and I have up here, to the consistory and the small council, is because there was a very large overlap. I don't know. I can't say if there was a one-to-one overlap, but a very close overlap between the consistory, the elders, and the small council. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. These are both elected officials. Whom are we going to elect to the small council to be our representatives, to lead us and govern us? We're going to elect those individuals within our city who are outstanding, who have the authority, the tradition, the prestige. They're probably going to be older, and that young people usually aren't going to be elected to the small council. But whom do you elect as elders? Those same people. So even if institutionally they're completely distinct, the consistory or the elders and the small council, practically they're one and the same. So what the consistory would proclaim, the small council would adopt. And that gave this the force and the power. Now, again, this was based on elections. It wasn't based on the structure. The structure was these were two separate institutions. But practically, they functioned almost as a single unit. That then brought up the issue of, the consistory and the small council, we are responsible for governing and administering the church. But what consists of the church? How do we know what is genuinely the Christian church? Calvin, in his ecclesiastical ordinances, you'll read, but also then further developed in his institutes, said that there are three ways to identify the true church, called the marks of the church. Pure preaching of the gospel, and the correct celebration of the sacraments. Now, those two had been there almost from Luther on. Luther has the same problem in terms of, once we get past, especially past 1530, how do we organize the church? What do we know what is right and wrong? And there are two defining principles. The pure preaching of the gospel, which was the very origins of Luther's message and the evangelical movement, and then and then the sacraments. Because the sacraments were there from the beginning. And I think I've already said, but at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, going all the way back to medieval Christendom, the height of medieval Christendom and the medieval papacy with Innocent III, they proclaimed there to be 7 sacraments. And a sacrament was seen as the means of grace, the means by which we receive grace. Now with Luther and thereafter, those sacraments for Luther were 3. He said, marriage is not a sacrament. Extreme unction is not a sacrament. Confirmation really isn't a sacrament, a separate sacrament. Neither is ordination. For Luther, there are 2 primary sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper. For Luther, those were the 2 that were absolutely essential. Then Luther kind of was unsure. He went back and forth in terms of confession. Basically, Luther kept confession as a sacrament. Differently understood. So you could also confess. You don't have to confess to a priest and go through the whole rigmarole of absolution and penance and all those things. But he said confession is such a gift to be able to confess your sins to someone and have God forgive you. And have that someone pronounce God's forgiveness, because we know God forgives us, but it's one thing to know that, it's another thing to feel that. And so if I can confess what I've done to somebody, and if it's a priest, fine, but even if it's, someone whom I just really trust and admire, if they can pronounce me, say, Brother Martin, you are absolved, God loves you and forgives you, that's a huge help. And Luther says, I'm not going to allow that to be taken from me. So for Luther, there's really 3 sacraments, but in other views from Zwingli on, there's only 2. It's not like confession, we get rid of confession, but it's baptism and the Eucharist, or the sacraments, which is baptism and the Eucharist. Those are the big 2. But Calvin adds a 3rd mark of the church. In addition to pure preaching of the gospel and the correct celebration of the sacraments, namely baptism and the Lord's Supper, he adds discipline. Where there is discipline within a community, there, together with the pure preaching of the gospel and the correct administration of the sacraments, there you have the true church. Discipline is how we live. Do we live a disciplined life? Now, I'll be talking more about this when we get in next lecture, talking about the institutes, because it all gets back on Calvin's view of the law, which is very different from Luther's. Keep in mind, Calvin was a trained lawyer. He was not a trained theologian. He was a self-taught theologian. For him, law is all important. But again, I'll be talking more about that next lecture. That issue of discipline, how do we enforce it? How do we judge it? How do we, where's the line of making allowances for human fallibility or fallibility? And no, that's not acceptable. And what are the punishments? And that led to, again, when Geneva has been called a theocracy, it is based on that 3rd mark of the church for Calvin, discipline, as part then of the ecclesiastical ordinances, which had been adopted by the city council, made into law for the city-state that was Geneva. That's where that is all coming from, in terms of the structural understanding. Have up here the most godly city, because again, as I already mentioned, John Knox, who was to be the Calvinist reformer of Scotland, the founding father of Presbyterianism there in Scotland, referred to Geneva as the most godly city. He said, my God, this is amazing. This is really a beautiful way, because these people now are really being Christian based on how they live their lives. I have up here the most godly city, and point 1 is social control. There's been a lot written about social control in the Reformation. How do you get people to actually do what you want them to, or what you believe they are supposed to do, or even what they might believe they're supposed to do? How do we structure society to control people's behaviors and actions? Law is one of the major aspects that we do that by. And if you break the law, you suffer the consequences, or so the theory goes. That's why we have traffic laws, even today. It is for social control. Because if we didn't, people, for a large part, ignore the traffic laws anyway. But just pretend and think and imagine what it would be like if there were no traffic laws, no stop signs, no rules about when you can turn and when you can't, do you have to signal or not, how fast you can go. It would be a horrible, horrible mess. And so there is a vested interest for the good of the city or the state or whatever to implement laws to control unbridled human behavior. So not everybody can do whatever they want. Now, in Calvin's Geneva, far more than what had ever been in the medieval church, in the medieval Christendom, there was a level of social control that was implemented and enforced. There can be the formal structures of social control, such as laws and statutes and regulations. And then there can be the informal called social pressure to make sure, oh, are you conforming? You're not doing things the way they're supposed to be doing, based on shame. So it's like social pressure, quote, shame, combined with laws and punishments, were the mechanisms by which the governing powers, in this case the consistory in conjunction with the small council, affected social control within the city. And this discipline aspect was basically related to morality. We have to get rid of public drunkenness, and I've referred to this before, but this then becomes institutionalized. We have to do away with gambling. We have to do away with prostitution. We have to regulate and strictly limit divorce. And we have to enforce these policies and not allow dissensions. Now, how do you go about doing that? Well, some issues could be serious enough. There would be crimes tried by the small council, because the small council was also the court system. Just as with the bishop had been the court system. But with the expulsion of the bishop, the small council becomes the judge, just as the Roman Senate was. So that's not anything necessarily all that radical in that sense. But they had a tool besides, let's say, imprisonment, namely the tool that had always been used: excommunication. Excommunication, the banning of someone. I have up there, enforcement is the ban, expulsion. I don't have the term excommunication, but the ban, expulsion. Expulsion was you are expelled from the city. You're banned from the city. What does excommunication mean? It means you are cut off from the community, from communion with the community. So yes, even here I'm even talking about the medieval understanding of excommunication, which was always seen as the spiritual sword to exert authority. You could be expelled from receiving all the sacraments because you were kicked out of the community of the church, but also then from the city. And especially in Calvin's Geneva, that's what the ban meant. You were sent out of the city. This became a very feared institution and a feared punishment. And again, Kingdon has written a couple books dealing with this in terms of marriage and divorce in Calvin's Geneva, and other aspects of Geneva. And one of the stories he tells is about this guy, I forget whose name it was, but he was just a regular citizen. He was not a bad person in any way. He was not even, let's say, an immoral person. He was not one of the city drunkards or so. But he stood in opposition to the consistory. He just thought, what these people what they're doing are not really helping much at all. And so it is not a help to, I'm sorry, here I'm having to deal with my computer who it says I'm supposed to reschedule, restart. I don't want this to get messed up. If I do it tomorrow, there we go. My apologies for this. Okay, there we go. That should do it, I hope, for now. So I'm sorry, I don't know if you saw any of that on your screen, but I was a little bit distracted because I had this pop-up all of a sudden. It says restart now or reschedule. I thought I don't want it to be restarted now because I'm in the midst of a lecture. Hopefully that got taken care of, but if for some weird reason all of a sudden this all goes off, my apologies. It wasn't my fault. I think I rescheduled it. Anyway, enough said. So the whole point was this guy, the Kingdon gives this case that's talked about, was just critical of what was going on in Geneva. And he was in a public pissoir. Now, I don't know if any of you know about public pissoirs, which is simply the French form of pissers. When I was in Paris, they still had them. I haven't been in Paris for a while, but back in the 90s. They're basically a place where men can go in and urinate, but they're open. They're just like on the side of the street, and they cover you up from about here to your knees, and you go in, there's a trough, and you pee. People are walking by, you can say hi. Not very comfortable. But that's what they had. So this guy was in a pissoir talking to a friend of his who was also there, and he was saying, these people in the consistory, they're no more Christian than I am. Someone heard of that, someone passing by, reported this guy to the consistory. He was hauled into the consistory and banned from Geneva. He had to abandon his property, told to get out of Geneva. He had to go somewhere else. He had to move. Simply because he said that these damn members of the consistory are no more Christian than he is. Because he saw that they were hypocrites. And there was some legitimacy there. I won't go into all those aspects. Also with Calvin, in terms of using the law and bending the law to his benefit when it helped. But this harsh imposition and strict governing and spying of people led to this sense of fear and anxiety that you could be, you might never know whom you're talking to or who is going to turn you in. So it's like you can say, well, this is just the SS, the early form of the SS, and that's going way too far. But in some ways, there's an aspect there because it's really the social control with that social coercive power of conformity. A little bit like, if you are in a neighborhood downtown, like where we are, and if one of your neighbors, we don't have neighbors who do this anymore, but there have been someone down the street, and so who leave garbage all over their front lawn, or who burn in their backyard garbage when they're not supposed to be burning. You can call the city and say there's a problem here, and they will come out and take care of it, so to speak. That was kind of the same mechanism, but it was an issue with more morality. You could be hauled in before the consistory simply for saying the consistory members are no more Christian than I am. That's what we're getting at. But it also was more serious issues as well. It's not simply morality. Even I shouldn't say just simply morality. Calvin would say, "What? How can you say just morality?" Because no, that was the whole point of it for Calvin. But Calvin used this model. He almost used Geneva as a laboratory for how can we actually affect Reformation in France. And Calvin, even though he's leading Geneva, he still always has that eye on France to say, we have to convert France. And he establishes this kind of program of people coming from France to be trained in Geneva, to learn from Geneva. He founds the Genevan Academy, he starts training pastors to send them back into France. They start smuggling books translated into French into France. This whole kind of almost underground railroad, which I think I mentioned last lecture, that led to the increasing spread and underground strength of the Protestants in France. And that was really Calvin's hope. And as we'll see with his preface to Francis, as you will read that too this week, and we'll talk about it next lecture, he is so insistent to Francis, nothing's wrong with us. We are loyal Frenchmen. We are concerned about France. You will see that, Your Majesty. And that letter remains unchanged in every edition of the Institutes up until 1559. But I'll be talking more about that next week. But here we see the ecclesiastical ordinances. So that's really what Calvin was doing, is more using Geneva as an experiment for how best can we organize the church so we can bring about the Reformation in France that we're hoping to bring about. And it became, his ecclesiastical ordinances became the model, at least the model document, for the Calvinist traditions, whether that be Presbyterianism in Scotland, the Reformed tradition in the Netherlands, or within the other refugee communities, such as the refugee community in London of French fleeing from the persecutions and going to London or Geneva. It got to be a real kind of mess. We start talking about international Calvinism, also then not only with the refugees, but then where cities started introducing the Reformation based on the Calvinist model. This is what was going on, and this is what was seen as Calvinism. I'll talk later about the difference between Calvin and Calvinism. But for now, this is what was going on with Calvin. And part of that, too, was the pure preaching of the gospel, the correct administration of the sacraments, as well as discipline, those three aspects. So in some ways, it is morality and it is theology. Talked about the ban. Well, that was an effective tool. Another effective tool was what it has always been, burning heretics. That happened in Geneva in 1555 with the burning of Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus was a medical doctor. He actually was attributed with having discovered the pulmonary circulation of the blood through the lungs. So he was not unintelligent. He was not untrained at the time. He was, let's say, a radical because based on his own study of the scriptures and so, he denied the Trinity. So there's no evidence that this is a Trinity, that there's a Trinitarian structure here. So in that sense, he became part of the Unitarian version, that became the Unitarians, and so, or at the time they were known as the Anti-Trinitarians. There's a big faction of Poland, the Polish Anti-Trinitarians, part of the Radical Reformation, which I'll talk about next week. But Servetus thought, he was arrogant enough. He thought, he could convince Calvin that he was right. So he actually goes to Geneva to convince Calvin. He goes to Geneva. Now, his writings had been getting out there, so he was known to be this radical heretic in the eyes of the Catholics, in the eyes of the Lutherans, by this time in the eyes of the Anglicans. So when he goes to Geneva, he's recognized, he's seen, he's known, he's arrested, and he's tried for heresy, and is condemned to death for heresy. Now, Calvin advocated, we shouldn't burn him, we should just behead him. That's a more humane means of execution. But the city council, who had tried him, said, no, we are going to burn him as we've always done with heretics. A public burning. And Michael Servetus was burned in 1555 in Geneva by the city council and Calvin. One of the people there, one of the scholars in Geneva at the time, was a man by the name of Sebastian Castellio. And after the burning of Servetus, Castellio reportedly said, to burn a man is not to defend a doctrine. It is simply to burn a man. Now, that attitude in 1555 was extremely rare. Extremely rare. Why? Because just as throughout Christendom, as it had always been, so to speak, even though I think I've said this before, medieval Christendom, they didn't really burn many heretics whatsoever. I think the first burning actually was in 1310. There were heresies, there was condemnations, but there weren't really burnings. There's the witch trials that had heated up in 1555. They're really heating up. More Protestants executed witches than the Catholics. But the point is, a heretic could jeopardize eternal salvation. I think I brought this up before in terms of the medieval understanding of the responsibility of the priesthood, of the bishops, of the princes and kings and emperors. They're responsible for their subjects and will have to answer to God for that. If you are a city-state, who's the responsible party? The city council. So if you allow open public drunkenness, if you allow prostitution, you're allowing rampant sin, and you are going to have to answer to God for that. If you allow a heretic to flourish in your midst, that is jeopardizing the eternal salvation of your, not subjects in this sense, but your citizens, the people you are responsible for. Physical death is just one thing, but eternal death is a completely other issue. And we are still in that sense of this is important and we are responsible for it. So, of course, we're going to burn them. It's our duty and responsibility to do so, just as it's always been going back ages. That mentality, when I talk about the issue of the Reformation being an increasing lack of toleration, whereas the popular version out there is, oh, toleration begins because, thank God, we've gotten away from the authority of the dictatorial authority of the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church. That is such nonsense and completely ahistorical, because really with the Reformation, there is an increase in the lack of tolerance in the context of the increased mechanisms used to enforce conformity. And we're talking more about this later. We're talking about confessionalization. But we see that's what was going on with Servetus and with Calvin. It's not like, how could they do something so retro? It's not retro. It was their. Why didn't they just ban them? Because it's one thing to say, okay, you are a public drunkard. You have to get out of our city because we're going to guard our city. That doesn't mean you're a heretic. We're not going to burn public drunkards. We're not going to burn prostitutes. Just get them out of our city. You know, what do we do with the homeless? No, I'm not supposed to enter the political fray, but okay, we're not going to have homeless anymore in our city. I'm throwing this out as a hypothetical. So we're going to get rid of them, get them out of our city. We're not going to throw them in prison as criminals. Maybe they will. Maybe some places will. Maybe, but we're going to try to expel them from the city. Now, they could just say, we're going to provide housing for you, but no, we're going to expel them from the city, clean up the streets. That was the issue of morality. But when it comes to doctrine and theology, heresy can infect the souls of other people. That's a big distinction. Also for Calvin and Geneva. It's one thing, immorality was not going to necessarily lead to eternal damnation necessarily. It could, but not necessarily. It wasn't necessarily going to affect other people. Because it was known, like, how many of you want to be prostitutes? How many of you want to be public drunkards? How many of you want to criticize the consistory? A lot of people. This is where it gets like, where's that line? If you see what I'm getting at. But that was the issue with Servetus. And how do we deal with that? Now, that is Geneva and Calvin's Geneva in short. We'll come back to that and we'll see when we talk about the French wars of religion that we're going to be breaking out in France, how that kind of plays out in France in any case. But what became known as Calvinism, based on the model of Calvin and Geneva, started to spread, not just among the refugee communities, but also in the established areas. I have up here the Reformation of the refugees. And that is not my term. That's actually the term coined by my doctoral advisor, Heiko Obermann, talking about the Reformation of the refugees. And seeing it as a distinct pattern of the Reformation. Again, I'll talk about patterns of the Reformation more next week. But we see it as this way of dealing with persecution. And how do we stand up to persecution? And here we have the refugee community in Geneva, many refugees from France, basically. We have the refugee community in England, refugees from France. And it is living under the threat of persecution. And that's where Heiko, who was, again, my advisor, and you've read about Heiko because I refer to him a lot in my Luther book, as his Luther book was an amazing publication, and I disagree with a lot of positions of his, not all of them by any means. But he himself was a Dutch Calvinist, and a Calvinist pastor. Um, and he wrote a couple books on Calvin, but he was working when he died on his major book on Calvin, which he never completed. I had worked with him as a research assistant on some of his one smaller earlier book on Calvin. And so we would talk about things. And he put forward his major thesis for the book he was going to write on Calvin. And that was as follows. Calvinism, in this sense, the doctrines of Calvin. He said, there's a beautiful religion under the cross, or namely, in the face of persecution. But when it becomes an established religion, as he said, as it did in the Netherlands in the 17th century, an institutionalized, established religion, it becomes diabolical. Now, only a Dutch Calvinist could say something like that. What he meant was, when you are facing persecution daily, you don't know if you're going to be hauled out and killed. I'm talking about the refugees in France. This issue of fleeing or staying. What do we do? I talked about that a little bit last lecture too. What do you do? And there was animosities between the French Protestants following Calvin's ideas who stayed in France and Calvin there in Geneva when Calvin would criticize the Nicodemus, as he referred to them. And they're basically saying, screw you, Calvin. It's one thing for you to say that in Geneva. It's another thing when we're here facing the potential of being burned if we come out publicly. There's an issue. There's a difference between grasping onto the positions of Calvin to help deal with the situation of persecution or living under the cross. It's another when they become implemented from above as an authority to be enforced. That was his point. And what happens, we see this kind of switch as Calvinism spreads, that it gets very far away from the actual positions of Calvin. It actually flips Calvinism right on its head. Flips Calvin, I should say, on its head in terms of the doctrine of predestination, in terms of the sense of discipline, morality, the relationship between the two. Just as a little indication, I may have already said this. I don't remember if I talked about this before. I may talk about it again later. For Calvin, predestination, as it had been for Augustine and had been for Paul, you didn't really know if you were predestined, if you were part of the elect. But you can look back on your life and see evidence that you were, that God's providence is there saving you, keeping you. And that gives you the faith and the security to know that you are in God's hands, whatever might happen. That was Calvin's understanding of predestination. You can't look forward, say, okay, even though this was a phrase that has been used before. If you're not predestined, see to it that you become predestined. Now, that became a problem because what everybody wants to know is, am I going to end up in heaven? Which meant, then, are you predestined for heaven? If you don't know, how do you find out? These marks of the church, especially discipline, became the key. If you live a moral, disciplined life, then clearly you're part of the predestined. And so you need to work as hard as you can to live that moral, disciplined life. And if you do, God will reward you. Because God's not going to reward the damned. God's not going to reward people whom God has predestined to hell. God's only going to reward those whom he has chosen to reward. The elect, the predestined. So therefore, your success in life becomes a sign, an increasing sign of your predestination. Therefore, the harder you work, the more moral you are, the clearer is your predestination. that became the Calvinism that had set Calvin on his head, because that is simply the works righteousness that had been there as never before. It's even worse than that. And it leads to the prosperity gospel, which is a more recent development. This idea that if you are wealthy, that means God is allowing that, and that is God shining forth God's favor on you. So the wealthier you can be, the more divine favor you have. The gospel is about getting wealthy. That's a later perversion, and Calvinism wasn't quite that far yet, but it was moving in that direction because it took Calvin's understanding of predestination in the context of persecution and being in God's hands into a program of works righteousness. We must work to be successful, to be moral, to be clean, to be, disciplined, and we will succeed. And the more we succeed, the more evidence we have of God's favor and grace. Rather than with Calvin, always God's grace precedes all of that. Anyway, those are for later developments. Just as I've always said, there is always a difference between the individual who establishes a doctrine, whether it's Thomas Aquinas or Luther or Calvin or Augustine, going all the way back, and then their followers when it turns into an ism. So there's a distinction between Augustine and Augustinianism. There's a distinction between Thomas Aquinas and Thomism, a distinction between Luther and Lutheranism, and a big distinction between Calvin and Calvinism. But that is what we're looking at and talking about. This being in the hands of God in the face of persecution, that kind of defines the Reformation of the refugees. Even as the Reformation of the refugees in Geneva became fused with the city Reformation as a fusion of two different types. That's what makes Geneva so strange and odd as well. It's not just the city Reformation called the Magisterial Reformation. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about this next week. Magisterial reformers, in terms of the magistrates implementing Reformation, it is that, but it's also based on the Reformation of the refugees, which Calvin was himself, giving that unique character to the city Reformation of Geneva. And on we go. Now, Calvin dies, and I always forget because I mix it up with Melanchthon. 1560 or 1562. I forget which. Philip Melanchthon dies in 1560 and Calvin dies in 1562, or Calvin dies in 1562 and Melanchthon dies in 1560. If I had to guess, I'd probably say Melanchthon dies in 1560 and Calvin dies in 1562. But there, I would say follow the textbook, follow Lindbergh in those days, because I'm saying right now, I'm not sure. I know it was one or the other. Okay. I think it was, I don't know. Yeah, anyway. For Calvin's death date, follow Lindbergh. I think I'm 99.8% sure it's either in 1560 or 1562. My apologies. He's succeeded in Geneva by his right-hand man, who became kind of his follower, Theodore Beza. And this is just at the beginnings of the outbreak of what would be the First French War of Religion. Civil war in France over Calvin against the Catholic, most Christian king of France. And we'll see how that all plays out later lectures. But next lecture, we will then kind of go back a little bit and focus on more of the doctrine of Calvin's institutes and the impact that his institutes had. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.